Welcome, everybody. We'll let the audience here build in just a second.
Sounds good.
So I'm John Harry, Milwaukee County Historical Society. We got Craig Crosby, who I'll get to his introduction in just a bit, and then Liz Garibay. So yeah, we just let the audience build. And if you're watching this later on the recording, thanks for tuning in too, and catching us later. I know everybody can tune in at once, but through the wonders of modern technology, we can all experience this and come together over a cool topic like beer history. Liz, if you want to kick her off right now, and then we can get into it.
Awesome, thanks, John. Welcome everybody. My name is Liz Garibay. I'm with the Chicago Brewseum. Excited to have you all be here for another Brewseum event. Also excited to present this event to you as a collaboration with the Milwaukee County Historical Society, our good friends up in Milwaukee. We've been doing these events every week, every couple weeks since mid-March, and we're trying to tap into all aspects of beer history and culture, past and present. And I'm particularly excited about this show tonight because we've got John Harry, who is a member of our League of Historians, with Craig Crosby talking about a brewery that many people haven't heard about that they should know about. So thank you to both John and Craig for being here tonight to talk about Peoples. Quick events coming up for the Brewseum, just in case you guys are interested. This Sunday, we have a conversation about beers in the U.S. and the UK during World War II. And then in a couple of weeks, we have a conversation happening with our friends at the Art Institute of Chicago, talking about Monet in Chicago and its connections to beer in collaboration with an exhibition opening at the Art Institute this fall. Also talking about a beer we made with the Art Institute. So for all things Brewseum, please just go to chicagobrewseum.org. You'll see what we're up to. Thank you for tuning in and for your support. John and Craig are going to get this going. If you guys have questions for either John or Craig, please just use the comment section on this Facebook Live app or wherever you're on for either the Brewseum or for Milwaukee County Historical Society. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to these two young gentlemen. Thank you again for being here. And I'm going to now go watch with everybody else.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Liz, so much for doing this with us. This is great. Liz, she left. They got a great exhibit at the Field Museum when that thing opens up too. So just a heads up, if you're ever in Chicago, check it out. So yeah, my name is John Harry. We got Craig Crosby here tonight. We're going to talk about one of the first black breweries in America, black-owned breweries, I should say. A group of Milwaukee businessmen bought this little brewery in Oshkosh, Wisconsin in 1970. And one of those businessmen who did it was Craig's dad, Henry Crosby. So cool if we talk about your dad a little bit tonight, Craig?
Sure.
All right, awesome. So let me open up the presentation here. We'll have you, Craig, like kind of bring us through this a little bit at different points because you lived through this. You were a kid during all this. So.
Yeah, I was young, but I still remember bits and pieces of it. So it's still kind of fun.
Yeah, which is awesome. So looking forward to getting your perspective on this whole topic tonight.
Sure.
So quick introduction about me and how I kind of got to this point. So again, my name is John Harry. I am a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee in history. And through that, I'm also a Milwaukee County Historical Society Programs Fellow. So we do programs. We've actually been doing it every Thursday night. So this is just a kind of a special one since it's in collaboration with the Brewseum. So this Thursday, we're doing one on the origins of Milwaukee Summerfest this Thursday night. So hit us up on Facebook or Twitter or wherever, our website too. More information on that. One of the coolest things I've been able to do in my life was last summer, and thank God it was last summer, not this summer. I was an intern at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History with their beer and brewing curator, which proves that dream jobs do exist, right? It's a lot of fun. So Teresa McCullough is my mentor there, and she is documenting the history of beer and home brewing in America. And so how the brewing industry has transitioned from these small breweries like Peoples into many small breweries competing with the big guys. So that was a really great experience there. And I got to do a ton of research, and a lot of that research I'm going to present to you tonight as well. And then, as Liz said, I'm also a member of the Chicago Brewseum's League of Historians, their historical advisory board. So love to be able to contribute in that manner to a great beer history related nonprofit. And I did write a book that has nothing to do with what we're talking about tonight. But if you're into cool Wisconsin beer stories, I wrote a pictorial history book about the Stevens Point Brewing Company up in central Wisconsin. So one of the oldest breweries in the country. So if you want more info on that, you can put it in the comments and I'll tell you how you can buy that and stuff. But we're not going to talk anything about that tonight. Tonight, we're going to talk about African Americans in brewing, specifically during the Civil Rights era. So contrary to what has been put in news articles and what may be commonly known, Peoples was actually not the first African-American brewing company in the United States. So there were some predecessors to Peoples. As far back actually as 1955, there was a guy in Trenton, New Jersey or Philadelphia. The news reports are conflicting on it, but a guy who named John Randolph Smith, who was actually blind, he bought the Colony House brand, and he was Colony House Brewing Company. Not a lot is known on that. So that's kind of, I just learned that from a colleague not too long ago. So 1955 was the first black-owned brewery, we think. Regardless, Peoples was also beat out by Sunshine Brewing Company. You see their label on the left there in Reading, Pennsylvania, honestly by about 6 months. But Sunshine Brewing, Doug Hoverson, who wrote a great book on all beer history in Wisconsin, he was the one who, I got to give him props for discovering that one. And then they weren't exactly a brewery. They had a beer brand. It was called Black Pride. It's actually one of my favorite beer labels to look at too. I just think it's cool imagery. A beer as proud as its people was their slogan. But they were actually out of Chicago, and they brewed their beer in West Bend at the old Lithia Brewing Company. They did what's called contract brewing. So they paid these people to brew their beer. And that was also in 1969. Peoples was under black ownership in 1970. So just trying to give you a bit of a timeline there. But that's not to say Peoples is not important. Peoples is incredibly important. It's the first black-owned brewery in Wisconsin. And, Wisconsin and beer go together, right? It's one of those things. And so the fact that a group of black businessmen bought a brewery in a very white state and in a very white industry is really important. So let's get into it. So we're going to talk a bunch about Craig's dad, Henry, in just a little bit. But the guy who was kind of bringing everybody together around these business ventures was a guy named Ted Mack. So just some background on Ted Mack. He was born in 1930 in the Jim Crow South in Alabama. Obviously, a lot of discrimination going on during that time. He was a very smart guy, a very gifted athlete as well. He tried to get into the University of Alabama, wanted to play football there, wanted to go to school there, and he actually witnessed the registrar throwing his application in the trash. He had some offers from other black colleges in the South, historic black colleges and universities, if you've heard that term before, but he wanted to wait for something that he could get the same quality education that white students were getting. So he wanted to go break a barrier somewhere. He did end up actually, though, getting drafted into the Korean War before that happened in 1950, and he served in the Korean War. But after he got out, he got a football scholarship at the university, at Ohio State University, the Ohio State University, right? He was the first black athlete from Alabama to get a football scholarship there. But he wasn't happy there for whatever reason. Don't know exactly why. But he transferred to Marquette University here in Milwaukee, and I'm not exactly sure, why he did that. But he did end up at Marquette. Here's his yearbook picture from 1958 at Marquette. Let's see if you can pick him out. Top right, if you can't find him yet. He's obviously the only black student in his class here at Marquette in 1958. And my dog is moving around, so if you hear some noise, that's what's going on. But yeah, so he transferred to Marquette. Marquette had a football team in the 50s, which is weird now because Marquette's only thought of as like a basketball school. But because of his transfer, Ted was sitting out a year of eligibility, waiting to play football for Marquette, and he injured his back, and he actually never ended up playing football for Marquette. but he still had a great offer to go to school at a great university. And so Ted ended up getting his degree in social work and trying to make a difference. And so he saw that that was maybe a way that he could make a difference through social work. But that also led him into activism. So he first got a job working for the county, the Milwaukee County Social Services, or the Welfare Department, as it was called then. And while he was working there, he knew he was really good at his job, but he had no upward mobility because he was black. So they would not promote him past a certain point. He could only make a certain amount of money that way, and he was not okay with that. And so he actually went to work for American Motors and A.O. Smith in Milwaukee, working for car manufacturing, as well as getting really involved in the Milwaukee civil rights causes. So he was one of the chairmen of the Milwaukee chapter of the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE. He was also a chairman of the Milwaukee Human Rights Council. In addition to that, he ran for office a couple times for citywide office, and unsuccessfully. But the guy had no rest in his bones. Ted Mack was looking to make a difference any way he could. He also organized a bus trip, a very famous bus trip. He led the Wisconsin delegation to Martin Luther King's 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. So he was very active in the civil rights movement. And here in 1964, this is a newspaper clipping of the white guy on the left is the governor, John Reynolds, and then Ted is on the right with his finger in his face, basically saying, you better appoint black judges as a governor because we helped you win the election. So here's what you do for us now. We helped you win this election. If you want the black vote the next time around, you need to appoint black judges. So he was giving him a stern talking to, and it made statewide papers actually too. So he was well on his way to becoming a civil rights icon in Milwaukee. But he saw that there was actually more than one way to gain civil rights, and not just through voting and school rights, but also through economics. Just to give you an idea of the 1960s and African Americans in Milwaukee, you might have heard being thrown around, especially now as the topics on race are very much in the forefront of all of our minds, that Milwaukee is still one of the more segregated cities in the United States. How that came about was on the map on the left. That is what's called a redlining map. So in the 1930s, the federal government they were giving government-backed home loans to banks to give out to people, white Americans, I should say. And while they came up with a color coding system to dictate the risk that would be involved in giving home loans to people in different neighborhoods. And as you can imagine, they basically zeroed out all the African American areas. So the red and yellow parts of the map are the high risk areas. The red parts, that's why it's called redlining now. But they basically would not back home loans, which kept African Americans out of home ownership for those areas, and kept them segregated in effect. So with that, Milwaukee had a very vibrant and very hard-fought civil rights battle over open housing here in Milwaukee in the late 1960s over that issue. And the map on the right is just to show the expansion of the black neighborhoods in Milwaukee from 1940, which is the smallest part and the darkest color on that little map, to 1960, and then 1980. That whole northwest side becomes a very African American area, which it still is today, and because of those redlining maps. So you can see where that actually starts from. So Ted Mack, as they have these economic issues, he's saying, well, we need to have economic power. Now, Craig, you grew up in part of the 1960s and then the 1970s in Milwaukee. Yeah. Do you remember any of these things going on that were the open housing marches or anything like that?
Well, when I was, the first house that my parents owned was on, I believe, like 15th and Burleigh in Milwaukee, which is right in the heart of the central city. And I do remember seeing military jeeps with troops on the back with machine guns and that kind of thing. So, going down going down the street. So that's when I was first remembering seeing things, and that was some, especially for a little kid, that's some scary stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, my cat is yelling at me right now. He just ate and he gets all excited. So yeah, that must have really had an effect on your psyche as far as how race relations in Milwaukee were going. Did your parents try to explain those moments to you?
They did, and it was, my dad was a very blunt individual, and he didn't want to sugarcoat it, and he told me that this is the black people in the country are working towards getting equality,
Mm-hmm.
and this is them against the white folks, basically, and that is the mountain that we're climbing,
Mm-hmm.
so to speak,
Yeah.
So, and that's how they, both my mom and dad raised me that way, just out in the open. And, there are things that I remember him telling me when I was a young kid, simply because I'm black, and when I was in fourth grade, we moved to Mequon, which is a suburb of Milwaukee. And at the time, I could literally count the black kids in my school on one hand.
Wow.
That's how few there were. But I had my friends in the neighborhood, and guys that I'm still in contact with, today. And that's
Right.
From fourth grade. And like, one of the things that I remember my dad saying there is, we used to bike down the street to, it's called Stop and Go. It was a convenience store. And he said, the one thing that you always have to remember is that if something happens, if the shit hits the fan, he said, if you're in there with your friends, who are they going to remember? Who is the person behind the counter going to remember? They're not going to remember the 2 or 3 white kids there. They're going to remember you. So, I mean, in fourth grade, that's instilled in my head as, why is that happening?
Mm-hmm.
So that was the thing that my dad has always tried to work against.
And I remember talking to your mom at one point, and she said that they had to have a white friend of theirs who lived in that neighborhood vouch for them just to live up in Mequon.
Yeah. Well, they were looking at a house in Glendale, it's in Milwaukee County. It's about midway between the city of Milwaukee and Oshkosh County, where Mequon is. And I remember the realtor of that was handling the house that they were looking at. Basically, he said, I'm not sure if I can sell this home to you, because I don't know how the people, the neighbors will react. And that's basically saying, I don't know how the neighbors will handle black people being in their neighborhood.
Wow.
So, yeah.
So out of this, the inner core that have kept expanding out, as you see on the map there, became more and more impoverished. And so there's a Black Business Association that popped up, the Afro Urban Institute. Ray Alexander, who's a big civil rights economic leader in Milwaukee, he was the chairman of that. And basically, they laid out that at this point, 95% of Black people lived in this area in Milwaukee in 1970, and 95% of like Black poor people, below the poverty line, 95% of Black people on that economic level lived in this area. And so he got your dad together. Ted Mack was involved, and they formed this venture called United Black Enterprises. And their main thing was this attempted purchase of BLATZ Brewing Company. So I'm going to ask you a question about what you remember of this in just a second, Craig. But how this kind of came about was in 1965, Pabst had to integrate because all of the civil rights legislation being passed, and the employees and discriminatory laws or people who were being discriminated against could actually, go to court with the law and file grievances against companies. And so Pabst in 1965 actually owned BLATZ Brewing Company, and they had bought them in the late 50s. And immediately other breweries had filed antitrust suits against Pabst Brewing, saying you can't own that, you're too big now, which is kind of funny now when you think about how big, Miller Molson Coors or Anheuser-Busch is. But they eventually were forced to divest of BLATZ. But in 1965, Ted Mack got hired at Pabst to integrate the workforce. And so Ted Mack actually was responsible for hiring over 100 black workers on the production line at Pabst and integrating it, all the while working in life insurance as your dad did too, right?
Right. Yep.
Yeah. So they knew each other from the insurance world as well, because nobody was selling insurance to black people. So
exactly.
They were like the only two. And so 1968, it comes around, judge rules, Pabst, you got to get rid of BLATZ. And so there's a lot of bidders going at it. Heilemann Brewing from La Crosse, they brew Old Style. Grain Belt in Minneapolis, Stroh's out of Detroit, a bunch of other breweries that were trying to buy BLATZ. And then United Black Enterprises formed to put together their own bid. And do you remember any of that, Craig, of the guys getting together?
Very.
You were pretty young.
Vaguely, I was young, but I do remember meetings at the house. Mm-hmm. And it was one of those things where the men got together and the kids got together. So I remember I got to see I hung around with Ray's son Dane, and he and I are still close to this day. And but I was a little young, but I do recall bits and pieces of meetings at the house.
Sure. And so they keep on going. They put in a pretty huge bid, actually, when you think about black economic power. Their final bid was like $9 million, which is like crazy amounts of money.
Right.
And they knew they were being outbid, though, and they filed with the judge to say, hey, can we get an extension, like a 30-day extension, to see if we can raise a couple more $1 million to buy BLATZ? Because they were thinking, well, if we buy BLATZ, then we can provide jobs to the inner city black community.
Right.
And then also BLATZ is a well-recognized international beer brand. So this would be a successful venture. So even if we have all this investment that we have to pony up, then that's okay. But in the end, the judge denied their extension. He called their plans embryonic, which is pretty insulting. Heilemann's, so Grain Belt, Old Style. Heilemann, they bought it out of La Crosse, and BLATZ moved there. Essentially also moving all these jobs away from Milwaukee. So they, Ted Mack is quoted as saying, I now know what it feels like to be a brother off the street just fighting for a loaf of bread, as these white guys are patting themselves on the back for making another brewery deal and keeping out a minority. But they said they'd be back, and so the United Black Enterprises ended up going away. But both your dad Henry and then Ted and Ray Alexander and all these guys still stuck together, and they still wanted to buy a brewery because they saw that beer was like this thing where money would just leave the black community. Black people were drinking beer, and that would go to white companies, and the white companies would never invest in black areas. And so they said, well, let's see if we can get them to invest in our areas, or we'll buy the brewery. So they wanted to buy a brewery really bad, which brings us to Oshkosh. 1970, Oshkosh, Wisconsin. And there's a little brewery there called Peoples Brewing Company that had been around since 1911. Oshkosh, and I don't know if you remember, Craig, but they had their fair share of racial problems up there.
Oh, yeah. It's a sundown sundown town. So
yeah. So maybe you want to explain real quick what a sundown town was.
well, it basically, if you were a black person and you were out past dark, don't expect the police to help you. Don't expect anybody to help you. Don't expect shop owners or hotels or anything like that. To help you out. If you had an issue with your car, if you broke down, you're stuck by the side of the road until you can maybe walk into town or flag somebody down that might help you the next day. So
yeah, and I think that's like also putting it lightly for Oshkosh, because in some parts of the country, sundown town meant that your life may have been in danger as a African American.
Yeah, that's true too.
So Oshkosh in 1970 was overwhelmingly white. The population was around 50,000 people. On the census records, it says that 103 people were black.
Wow.
So that's overwhelming. Ted Mack, when they bought Peoples, ended up moving up there, and he, as far as he knew, was the only black family that was not connected to the local university. But the local university in 1968 had this thing happen called Black Thursday, where black students staged a sit-in in the president of the university's office, and when he would meet with them, some trashing of the office took place, and 94 black students got expelled.
Yeah.
So Oshkosh had its share of racial tension, even though they largely kept black people out. They still,
right.
They were. That's why, right? That's how they kept black people out, was through intimidation. So 1970 rolls around, and to give a kind of a industry-wide perspective on this, the rate of breweries going out of business in the 1960s and 70s was just catastrophic. So there were 750 breweries in existence in 1933. So after Prohibition, a bunch more breweries opened after Prohibition, stuff like that. But there's 750. And by 1973, there are only 65 breweries left in the United States. You think about that, there are 8,000 breweries now in the United States, which is crazy. I mean, you live in Grafton now, Craig. I know you guys got a brewery or two up in that neck of the woods now too.
Yeah, there's microbreweries, and to me, they make the best beer. So
right. So but at that point, these small breweries just were going out of business, and so the shareholders of Peoples at that point saw that they were going to have a hard road to claw out of this massive industry hole, where these big breweries like Schlitz and Pabst and Miller and Budweiser were putting them out of business really, really quick. And so they decided it ended up being this weird set of circumstances where they said, yeah, we'll sell to a group of black businessmen from Milwaukee because we'll get out. At the same time, it provided this opportunity for businessmen of color in Milwaukee to be able to buy a brewery in a really white metropolitan area. So April of 1960 is when the deal closed, and then October is when the brewery opened its doors. I didn't want to bring this picture up. So this is right after the sale was announced from the Oshkosh newspaper. And there's somebody pretty special on there, right, Craig?
Yeah, there's a guy on the left side of the screen. That's my dad. That's Hank. Well, Henry Crosby, but everybody called him Hank.
That's your dad right there. And then we were talking about Ray Alexander.
Yep, that's the person right next to him, and then Ted Mack is right next to Ray.
Yep, and then some lawyers that they were working with to finalize the deal are the two white gentlemen in the photo too. So 1970, the doors open. Did you go, Craig, to the opening?
I remember being up there and walking into what was like the end of the bottling line. That was the biggest open area, and being a small kid, it just looked like I was walking into Miller Park. That's how big it seemed to me. And I remember just seeing the machinery and hearing everything, and just my eyes were just open. I was like, wow, that's that's some cool stuff. That's some big stuff right there.
Yeah, it's a big deal. I mean, it was a huge brewing company, compared to a lot of places too.
Right.
So there's Ted Mack, a picture there with him with the cases of Peoples bottles ready to go out to quench some thirst. You guys lived in Milwaukee during this? You guys never moved to Oshkosh, though, correct?
No, we were basically on 29th and Roosevelt, right near what's now, it was Cutler Hammer, now it's Eaton Corporation. So
did you go up to the brewery? Because the Peoples, and not to spoil the surprise, but did not last that long. But like, did you go in that 2 or so years? Did you go up to the brewery any other times?
Yeah, I'd go up there with my dad. Sometimes if he was just going up there to be there.
Mm-hmm.
So, but also because the Macs were up there, there are times when I went up and I hung out at their house while my dad and Ted and the other guys had meetings or business things or what have you. So, sure. But yeah, I was up there.
Cool. And like you said, it must have been just a fun time to be at the brewery.
Yeah.
So Ted Mack's plan and the whole brewery. So your dad was the vice president on the board of directors, and Ted was the president. So the 1 and 2 in command there. The plan was to make this a beer for Black culture in America at this point.
Right.
And so they had a warehouse and tried to establish a distributorship in Milwaukee. And they tried to get into a bunch of other urban areas. One of them being Gary, Indiana. So Gary, Indiana is a very big Black population there, but they had a lot of problems getting to Gary, Indiana.
Yeah, there was the first time that they were trying to do distributorship there, and a couple trucks basically full of beer, and they were stopped at the Indiana state line by the troopers, and they basically said, you cannot come across the straight line, the state line with a beer. If you do, it'll be confiscated and you're subject to arrest. So the drivers had to turn around and go back home.
Which is all because I was looking into that too, and it's because they could not find a distributorship. There were no Black-owned distributorships in Indiana that,
right.
and none of the white distributorships would sell a Black-owned beer.
Right.
And so and then there's this whole thing called the 3-tier system where you have to have a distributor in the middle in some states. And so I think, to me though, when I hear that story from you, I think that the whole, we're going to confiscate everything and we're going to arrest you, is a huge overreaction that I don't think white breweries would not have to contend with.
Oh, not even close. Not even close. Even as the turmoil of what's going on in the country now, that something like that wouldn't happen.
Right.
There's no way that it could.
So I think eventually they maybe did get into Indiana, but the part of the problem and this is not to come after the people of Oshkosh, because there were people that were white people in Oshkosh that invested in the brewery and bought stock because they saw it as something that they did not want leaving the city, right?
Right.
And Ted Mack and your dad were very charismatic people. They were very nice people. So
salesmen. They were salesmen.
Right. But as Ted Mack and your dad and the rest of Peoples was Black-owned, all taps, so all the taverns that had Peoples taps on, pulled all of them right away because they wouldn't want to serve a Black beer.
Right.
They did persuade all but 2 of them to put Peoples back on tap. But then there was also all these rumors that they were going to replace the white staff in Oshkosh with Black workers, which was false. And then they came after the quality of the beer and said that the beer wouldn't taste as good, which is ridiculous because the brewmaster was the same guy who made it before.
Right.
So that they actually sent the beer down to a Siebel Institute in Chicago. So the Chicago Brewseum folks probably have heard of that before, to get tested. And Siebel sent it back saying, yeah, this beer is fine. It's great. It's a premium product. So as, let me see if I got the next slide. Oh, another thing that really happened, was that Peoples actually kind of got kind of a cool thing. This is another of the success, even though they were having some sales problems at the outset. They actually got the beer served at Milwaukee County Stadium for Brewers games. and at the arena, which is now the Milwaukee Panther Arena, or
Panther Arena, yeah.
At that point where the Bucks were playing, so they actually got the beer in some pretty high vision or high value spaces. But people in Milwaukee, especially black people in Milwaukee, were not buying the beer. And there are many quotes from Ted Mack. I went down and talked to Ted's widow Pearl over the winter, and she lives in Atlanta now. And it was hard to figure out why the black community would not support the beer. Part of it might be that it was priced not expensive, but higher than the bottom barrel stuff. And when you need to feed yourself and your family, you're not always going for that next level up. And part of it's also that Peoples was this new brand, and so when you're loyal to a brand already, it's hard to convert people over, no matter who's owning it.
Right.
I don't know if you ever heard anything about that, Craig.
Not that I recall a whole lot.
Sure.
So that's I'm learning about that actually, but.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because the beer was actually selling really well in college towns across Wisconsin.
Well, it was funny because I have a T-shirt with the People's logo on it, and my wife and I were out shopping. We were at Costco over the weekend, and a guy came around the corner. People's beer, Oshkosh, Wisconsin. I used to drink that when I was in college, and I said, "Yeah, my dad owned that brewery in the 70s," and he said, "A lot of us drink that beer," and as it turns out, I went to college at UW Oshkosh.
Okay.
And a lot of the guys in my fraternity, the alumni who were around during that time, they said that People's Beer was the beer of choice for them over Miller or Pabst or Schlitz or, some of the other big beers.
Yeah. Which is got a big compliment. And I think there was a thing that people, because at that point there was a big counterculture revolution going on against the policies of Richard Nixon and the Vietnam War, and I think it's saying Peoples and it being owned by this group that was perceived as outsiders and renegades and minorities. It spoke to the college students being like, Peoples is against the man. But again, like in urban areas, sales were lagging, and as Ted Mack kept on expanding the reach of People's Beer, the expansion and the money they were spending on expanding was not keeping up with the sales. So in the first year of the ownership by your dad and Ted Mack, they lost about $100,000 just right off the bat, which was a huge hole to get out of. Now, one thing I didn't talk about at the beginning was how they financed all this stuff. They financed it through the Small Business Administration. At that point, Richard Nixon had this campaign pledge called Black Capitalism, which if you're thinking about Richard Nixon and anything to do with anything, you're probably thinking that guy was pretty crooked. And you're right. So Black Capitalism was basically, so we're going to get impoverished Black people off of welfare by giving them money to be entrepreneurs. The thing was they were basically taking the money used for social services and putting it into the Small Business Administration, saying, okay, now you deal with it. You're not our problem anymore. So don't give Nixon too much credit for black capitalism. But that was how they financed this. So they bought Peoples for $600,000, so considerably less than the BLATZ deal. That was $10 million. And they basically, the Small Business Administration ponied up $400,000, and the extra $200,000 had to be done by stocks. And so your dad bought a bunch of stock. Ted Mack put a lot of his personal savings into it, as well as the black community and white people in Oshkosh also. So the Small Business Administration in 1971 and 72 though started knocking, saying, "Hey, you got to start paying your loan back," which leads to the demise of Peoples Brewing Company by January of 1972. Ted Mack was saying we got to sell more stocks because we're falling behind and we need more for advertising because we can't compete with the big guys on advertising. He talked, about we need to move the brewery to an area that's more sympathetic to our cause, like somewhere in the South, maybe, where there's a bigger black population. Or he even talked about moving the brewery to Africa at one point, which sounds crazy, but there was there was also a big market for beer in Africa too. But when it all came down to it, Peoples closed in November of that year. All but like a couple employees were laid off, and the Small Business Administration liquidated the site. In the following years, the brewery was torn down in 1974. So other than like a very small part of it, but that was a big hit to end so quickly. Craig, do you remember what your dad was like at that point when it started to go under?
Well, I think the one thing that I do recall was discussion in regards to the military and their lack of wanting to help smaller business. The amount of beer that the military bought from Miller and Anheuser-Busch and all of the big guys, even a small percentage of that military business would have been enough. Probably, I feel it would have been enough to sustain the brewery, and there's a possibility that it still might be, producing beer today.
Well, and they actually, after Peoples closed their doors, your dad and Ted and Ray Alexander, they took the Small Business Administration to court over that.
Right.
Basically saying the government spends $76 million a year on beer from Anheuser-Busch. Therefore, we should be entitled to $1 million of beer business.
Right.
And like you said, so that proportion. I remember when I talked to your mom. Do you remember how much the government actually spent on People's beer? Your mom told me. I don't know.
No.
She said they spent $130.
For some reason, it doesn't surprise me.
No. So there's that systemic injustice going on right there.
Right.
They're not being given the same treatment as other breweries in the United States.
Right.
That have a lot more political power. Another thing that happened a few years later that came to light was there was these big payoff schemes from the big brewers to distributors and retailers. And so like Schlitz had a $1 million payoff fund that basically like encouraged distributors and brewers to push their product, or retailers to push their product, with the threat of, you either take this money and sell our beer, or we will pull our products. And Schlitz being so popular at that point, you couldn't afford that, right?
Right.
As a small distributor or as a liquor store or as a bar or something like that, you really couldn't afford that. And so they weren't just keeping Peoples out, they were keeping all these little small breweries out. But that didn't come to light till much later. And the government slapped a big fine on them. But for them, that's just the cost of doing business.
Right.
So 1972, Peoples goes out of business. So we talked about like that Peoples was not the first African-American owned brewery in the United States, but until the craft era, they were the last. So a long time went by before that. So here's a later picture of Ted Mack. Ted, his family stayed in Oshkosh for a little while before they moved back to Milwaukee. He'd been selling insurance, like I mentioned before, so he went back to selling insurance. Ted Mack, by the way, was one hell of an insurance salesman. Some of his years, he sold over $1 million in life insurance. So that's pretty impressive. He also, with his social work background, and I think your dad was involved in the Misericordia Hospital.
Misericordia,
that's how you pronounce it. So, which was the first Black hospital, or the inner city hospital in Milwaukee.
Right. Yep.
And so they were involved as administrators of that. And then he set up a home for wayward boys, a group home for wayward boys.
I remember that. He also was part of the group that brought cable TV to the Milwaukee area. And I remember I started playing soccer when I was 5. Okay. And I played in Milwaukee. Our games were in Whitefish Bay. And when we moved to Mequon, my dad's like, well, I don't really want to have to drive you into Milwaukee for practice all the time and for games. And so we started the first soccer team in Mequon. So my dad was the one that started the first Milwaukee Kickers team in Mequon. And then with that, he was on the board of directors with the Kickers. He was nominated or inducted into the Kickers Hall of Fame. So he did a lot of things. He always had small business. He was always in sales, and that was his. He was such a people person. He didn't have to go into the used car salesman kind of thing. He sold on him and his personality.
Well, and I also think it's worth noting at this point, because both your dad and Ted Mack had college degrees.
Right.
And that's one of the first generations of black men to get, that there's a wave of finally being able to get college educations, and it shows.
Right.
So your dad, you guys obviously stayed in Milwaukee, moved up to Mequon, and then unfortunately your dad passed away in the early 2000s.
Yeah. 8 years. It just was 8 years ago.
Oh, 8 years ago.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah. So now I'm just trying to continue the legacy of the brewery through memorabilia.
Which is super cool to collect, right? Super fun.
I'm having so much fun, and I've met some really, really cool people through a couple Facebook groups. I'm not going to mention a name, but I have a buddy up in Oshkosh who has a collection that's just. When I walked into his basement and saw it, my eyes got real big and my jaw dropped, and my wife and I went in and checked it out. But I have a pretty substantial collection of stuff that goes back to pre-prohibition. People's beer, Chief Oshkosh beer. And the thing that's really neat, the coolest thing that I've found through collecting the memorabilia is there's quite a few guys, and I'm in regular contact with them through social media, that collect people's beer memorabilia. And they are a couple of guys are specific to just Oshkosh brewing.
Sure.
So it's really cool, and really it makes my heart happy to see that there are people that understood what he tried to do, what the mission was, and they appreciate that and for what it was, and are collecting the different memorabilias and artifacts from the brewery itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a cool way to keep that legacy alive. Because I think that's the fun thing about collecting this stuff is you get to find the stories out. But so Ted Mack ended up moving to Atlanta in 1982 with his family, and kept selling insurance and kept doing his thing down there. And unfortunately, Ted passed away last February.
Right.
So now it's it is up to you, your mom, and their kids and stuff too, of Ray Alexander's kids and Ted's kids, to kind of keep this legacy going, so that we all hear these stories. Because I think that one of the big things is that they were one of the last efforts in black-owned breweries before the craft era. But it's not like there's an abundance of black-owned breweries and craft beer. The Brewers Association put out a study, and I think it's less than 1% of all breweries in the United States, of almost 8,000 breweries, are black-owned right now.
A friend of mine sent me an article. He lives in Seattle, and he knew about my dad's brewery, so he sent me an article about a black-owned microbrewery, and he said it was very similar to like a Sprecher kind of setup out in Seattle. So
I think that's called Medier, which I know is a big friend of the Chicago Museum. So it all ties in. All ties in together. All right, so let's do some questions. How's that sound?
Sure.
Okay, cool. So if you have any questions, hit us up. Put them in the comments. We'll stick around for a few minutes to answer some questions. It's a cool opportunity to have somebody like Craig who lives through part of this, and is I think it's awesome that you're here and doing this, Craig. So really appreciate that.
I thank you for what you're doing, and the fact that you're spreading the word, spreading the good word to the people.
Well, I'll do my best. I'll put it that way. So let's start with Eric here. His comment says, either of us, can you speak to Henry and Ted's interest in beer? So why did they picked beer, but because of its economic capabilities to keep money in the black community. But maybe you, Craig, you can talk about your dad's interest in beer.
Well, well, he liked beer, but he knew that it's when you look at business, you're looking at, okay, what are the things that people are buying? And, if you can get into that, you should be okay. And the thought was, okay, this is a commodity that they're already purchasing. Mm-hmm. So let's give them the opportunity to support a black-owned, brewery, black business.
Right.
And with the hopes of being able to help other business down the, because there's more to it than just brewing the beer.
Sure.
And they wanted to do more down the line, transporting and the whole, so there's a variety of things connected to it. So,
do you remember beer being in other than Peoples, beer being in your house growing up? Or what kind of beers, I guess, is what I'm asking. Like, do you remember what your parents drank?
My dad, it was weird. He when I really remember beer in the house, he didn't like the big name beers. Maybe it was just because he didn't want to support Miller or, Anheuser-Busch or something like that. But I remember he really liked Meisterbrau.
Oh, to Chicago, Meisterbrau. Yeah. There you go.
So,
there it is. Yeah.
He drank that, and Leinenkugels. I remember he liked Leinenkugels. So
sure. All right. So let's see here. Joshua is asking. So the beer was never distributed outside of Wisconsin. Actually, they did get it into
Chicago.
They got it in Chicago. I think they ended up getting it into Indiana at one point after the distributor stuff got cleared up. I also read something that they got it into California.
That I'm not sure.
But I don't know if that was just publicized and never happened. But it was reported on that Ted Mack was saying, yeah, we've got this deal out there because they like that our beer tastes better because their water is horrible out there.
Yeah.
But did they produce more than one type of beer?
Yeah, they did. Well, the Peoples was a lager, but they also did what's called holiday beer, and that came out every year, October-ish. And they also had Bach beer. And Bach beer was the traditional fall beer, and a lot of companies tried to do it, some successfully, some not so successfully. The smaller breweries were the ones that seemed to do better with the Bach beer. So those were the beers that they had. Now, before Peoples was owned by my dad, they also produced ales and that kind of thing. But it was basically just the Pilsners and the lagers when they were there.
Well, and so the holiday beer also, like I just want to mention, was kind of like the regular lager, but like on diesel.
It was like very high in alcohol content. Yeah.
Because when you get to the holidays, you need to deal with your family. So
crazy uncle, and that was when you look at the label itself, it's the family at the table with dad standing up in front of the turkey, and one of the people at the table looked like everybody's crazy uncle. So that's okay.
We all have one.
Oh yeah.
All right. Let's see here. I'm just looking through. There's a lot of great questions here. Liz is asking, because you talked about collecting stuff, did your family keep anything from your dad's time in the brewery?
I have, if you see the beer tray above John's shoulder, yep, that's it. I have one that actually was my dad's. I also have my dad's stock certificate,
cool,
which is the coolest thing that I have in my collection. He did donate items. My mom and dad had donated items to different organizations in Milwaukee. So now I'm just collecting them back myself. But that's the only thing that I really have that was my dad's.
Sure. That's really cool that at least something got kept, right?
Right.
You have to track a bunch of other stuff down, but it's good that you held on to stuff.
Exactly.
All right, so I'm just going to end with this because this has been on my mind a lot. I know this has been on your mind a lot. Is their brand in the public domain as far as rights, and can we all come up with a resurrection of the beer? I know that Bare Bones in Oshkosh, and there's a guy in the Oshkosh area named Lee who's written a bunch of books. He's a beer historian there, and I know they've put out a Peoples beer, so there's a recipe.
Yes,
and I can tell you that I had not had the idea to do a collab, but I have been putting some feelers out. Let's just put it that way, on maybe getting a Milwaukee brewery to do this. The idea being that the goal was always to bring economic enhancement to the Black community of Milwaukee.
right.
And so have the beer be in support of economic development on the northwest side of Milwaukee,
Right.
and hopefully get produced. And then we can all taste it again. So we'll see if we can make it a collab.
Yeah.
But I think just getting the beer back would be really, really cool.
And Jody, I did actually.
Jody's the brewmaster at Bare Bones.
In Bare Bones, yes. So I did. I was up there over the winter, and I had a chance to try one of the beers that actually was the Chief Oshkosh recipe, and
across the street from people.
And it was phenomenal.
Yeah. So they're like lighter lagers as you might think of them today, but it was. Right. I know that Lee has put out a homebrew recipe of the Peoples thing, and I made it with my brother-in-law, and it is like crushable, I guess would be. It's very good. It's tasty beer. So I think that's all the questions we have for right now. And we're almost at an hour, so I think this is a good time for us to go, drink some beer, right, Craig?
That sounds good.
But Craig, you can hang out here because the stream will end. We can still keep talking.
Okay.
But everybody, thank you so much for tuning in. I know that the Chicago Museum's got a great lineup of programming. So hit up their social media or their website. And the Milwaukee County Historical Society appreciates you tuning in as well. We've got to talk about the origins of Summerfest coming up on Thursday. Also, you might have heard, we're reopening to the public coming up soon this weekend. So make sure that you keep a lookout for those communications. We're doing it safely, don't worry. We got to keep moving. So Craig, again, thanks so much for sharing your family's history with us. We really
no problem. This is awesome. Thank you.
All right, everybody, take care. Stay safe.